Believe it or not, there are people who can't wrap their heads around the use of non-medical drugs before the 20th century, but it was always so. From mind-expanding hallucinogenics for religious rites to painkillers to escape the grinding stress of everyday life. And for some, mood-altering drugs could aid in warfare. We all know that you stay away from someone who is in drug-induced frenzy, because they may have lost all senses of self-preservation. That was the story of the berserkers, who were said to be immune to fire and weapons during battle. The more likely story is that they just didn't care, and that terrified their enemies into retreat or submission. It must have been the drugs. This is one of the most famous drugs we are told Viking would use. But today we will break down all other forms of drugs like Handbane, weed, magic mushrooms, coke and opioids the Viking used for spiritual, war and everyday use. But first, who were the Vikings actually? The Vikings were a group of people who originated from Scandinavia and lived during the Middle Ages. The term Viking comes from the Old Norse word vik, which means pirate or raider. From 800 AD to the 11th century, many of these people left their homelands to seek their fortunes over water. They became a seafaring people, mainly warriors, called Northmen or Norsemen. Once they established themselves as people of the sea, they would raid coastal cities and undefended monasteries, especially in the British Isles. They would leave their mark during their raids, people calling them pirates, raiders and even traders. The Vikings settled much of modern-day Britain and the European continent, extending into parts of Russia, Iceland, Greenland and Newfoundland. Vikings didn't civilize themselves in a traditional sense, and they were in a Christian-based society. Nevertheless, historical records indicate that their warriors were capable of feats of strength and skill. Where did the skill come from? Was it a gift or something else? The drugs Vikings were known for: Viking culture and the berserkers. The Vikings were famously fierce and warlike people, but what was their culture like when they went raiding and pillaging? Like many other civilizations, they were structured similarly and included a caste system. As the top of their society were the nobles or local rulers called jarls, then the thralls or slaves, the huskarls, the jarl's guard, and finally the carls or freemen, which would have included fishermen, farmers and blacksmiths. The Vikings were also a very religious people, but believed in paganism, and it was this genuine belief that made their soldiers so formidable and fearless. They believed in Valhalla, a paradise-like afterlife reserved exclusively for fallen warriors. A special place in Valhalla was waiting for them if they died in battle. Ancient texts said that the warriors would be weaker and almost ill after raging, ending for days afterward. War and fighting defines their culture, but not every Scandinavian warrior was worthy of being called a berserker. It was likely that these warriors were of higher class. It is expected that the jarls picked those warriors. As we mentioned, the berserkers were full of rage and without care when going into battle. So much so that evidence suggests that they went into action without chest protection. However, in Scandinavian texts, berserkers are referred to as ulfheden, meaning warrior wearing wolf skin. So they may not have worn protective mail, but likely wore wolf and bear skins. Aside from that, these berserkers were known as crazed warriors who felt no pain and hacked through foes without remorse or hesitation. Since these warriors were predominantly better or stronger than their counterparts, what gave them their strength and brutal nature? So let's begin. The mushroom theory and the Handbane theory. Scientists believe that once they ingested the mushrooms, the warriors would go into a trance-like state known as berserker gang. Sources claim that the episode would start with tremors and chills, followed by a flushed face and quick agitations that soon exploded into full-blown rage. At this time, the warriors became resistant to fire and blade wound, and would howl like animals and bite the edges of their shields. A poet named Egil Skallagrimsson recalled these events in a book he wrote. Scientists had previously speculated that the berserkers were likely consuming fly agaric mushrooms, or Amanita muscaria, and panther cap, Amanita pantherina, which are hallucinogenic. These mushrooms contain a psychoactive compound called mucimol, which produces the high. The effects of the mushrooms include intense colors, sounds, smells, and out-of-body experiences. Generally, users would also experience micropsy, which makes things less threatening and smaller than they appear, leading to a feeling of omnipotence. This would explain the berserkers' ability to feel no pain, lack of fear, and their increased strength in battle. Unfortunately, these mushrooms are poisonous and can negatively affect subjects like vomiting, diarrhea, and twitching. In high doses, these mushrooms would be fatal. However, another theory suggests that berserkers were consuming Handbane, or Hyoscyamus niger, a poisonous plant with a yellow flower. Researcher Karten Fatur from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia is an ethnobotanist who studies the relationship between humans and plants. Fatur argues that based on his research into Norse texts, the effects of Handbane are very similar to the mushroom with a swollen red face, chills and tremors and a trance-like state. This plant contains hyoscyamine and scopolamine, which are dilarians. Handbane would inspire heightened aggression and unpredictability and reduce their sense of pain. These work by blocking the acetylcholine receptors in the brain and causing a person to become delirious and confused. Fatur believes that it's more likely the berserkers consumed Handbane, as it's found all over Scandinavia, whereas the mushrooms are not. Furthermore, violent aggression isn't a typical side effect of ingestion of fly agaric. In addition, the anesthetic effect of the plant may have also given the warriors the illusion of feeling no pain, giving their opponents the impressions of invisibility. Also, chattering, twitching, and bizarre behaviors like shield biting are common symptoms of drug-induced anxiety. Whatever the case may be, these elite warriors would have taken their obligations seriously. It stands to reason that they would be shock troops used to break up their opponent's armies. Then, after the berserkers sent them scrambling, the main army could push into battle. A ritual before battle. Since the berserkers were high members of the Viking society, it's safe to assume that Handbane would receive the same treatment, but of course, such devotion isn't offered lightly, and ingesting the plant in a ritual through smoking dried leaves or infusing the plant in a drink was possible during the Viking era. Further support for this idea was found in Hobro of Denmark, when archaeologists found several grave sites near the castle of Firkat. Firkat is an old Viking settlement, but approximately 30 grave sites were found and exhumed. One of them belonged to a high-level priestess. This priestess was buried with essential items and a pouch containing Handbane seeds. The priestess would likely have distributed these among the berserkers during a ritual. While the Amanita muscata is an interesting theory, it's unlikely that Vikings could use the substance due to the scarcity of the fungi. While they could grow themselves, it will be tough to do so due to their biology. Handbane is a more likely candidate, as it's quickly grown and found all over Scandinavia. It is possible that berserkers used Handbane in a ritualistic way before battle to help them achieve the famous invisible state. While the Vikings aren't the only ones known for using this rageful tactic, consider the Celts, Assyrians, or the Quachi from the Aztec warriors. They are by far the most notorious. Vikings did not only use drugs for battle though. They were highly religious and often used drugs like hallucinogenics when worshipping the gods. So, is there any evidence that Viking rituals and practices were drug-fueled? Vikings lived within a martial culture, yet when it came to raiding and wars, they observed a structure unique to their society. This was structured like many others with roles for farmers, fishermen, local rulers, and the Jarl's own guard, huskarls. There were also defined groups of warriors outside of this typical society. The most commonly known were the berserkers, which literally mean bear shirt in Old Norse. Berserkers were a class of shock troops who got their name from wearing hollowed out bear head belts in battle. Many are claimed to have chewed dried mushrooms pre-battle for the frenzy effect and dull pain should they get injured. They are the famed shield chewers, as depicted in Viking art, such as the Lewis Chessman one. Archaeological evidence points that berserkers using mushrooms with little evidence to support other drugs used. For example, mushrooms from Scandic and non-Scandic regions were found in their belongings. Dried mushrooms were likely easily acquired via trade, while anyone could be a berserker. The same was not true with Uveldnar, whose name means wolfhide, refers to a shamanistic class of warriors, the elite of the elite. Ulfhetnar were secretive and operated in small groups. A warrior had to be invited to join them, whereupon they would learn a new level of fighting skills from an older Ulfhedin. In contrast, berserkers numbered in the hundreds and openly lived and served a king, jarl, or a chieftain. Ulfhetnar also stand apart from berserkers because they painted their bodies black and went tunicless, shirtless, into battle. They did not use shields, nor did they even have armor. Berserkers typically fought with the Viking norm and axe and shield. Some fought without their tunic on, but it wasn't set standard as with Ulfhetnar. There are numerous written records of berserkers in battle, but only one of Ulfhetnir fighting alongside berserkers in an epic 9th century battle to unify Norway. Ulfhetnir usually worked in the shadows like special forces today. Little else is known about the Ulfhetnir because they were so secretive, but one thing is certain: they were prolific drug users undertaking shamanistic forest rituals over a lifetime of worship practices. Fly agaric and panthercap are not the only mushrooms or plants to cause psychedelic effects. Psilocybin mushrooms, also known as magic or psychedelic mushrooms, are well known for their effects associated with the substituted tryptamines, psilocybin and psilocin. Tryptamines are also well established in traditional shaman medicine. So yes, there is sound physical, archaeological evidence and a logical scientific foundation based on the mechanism of action muskimol to support the use of amanita, species of mushrooms, by Vikings and conflicts. The Vikings are not only the group to have used these mushrooms. Wasson reported the presentation of a paper in 1980 at the Royal Scientific Society in Uppsala that stated Swedish soldiers of the Varmland regiment were seized by a raging madness. Foaming at the mouth, on inquiry it was learned that the soldiers had eaten a fly amanita to whip up their courage to a fighting pitch. Now let's move on to another famous drug used by the Vikings: wheat. Norwegian Vikings grew hemp. Cannabis was cultivated 1300 years ago at a farm in southern Norway. The Sostelli farmstead in Norway's southernmost Vest-Agder county offers strong evidence that Viking farmers actively cultivated cannabis. A recent analysis shows the cannabis remains from the farmstead date from 650 before Christ to 800 after. And this is not the first sign of hemp cultivation in Norway, this far back in time, but the find is much more extensive than previous discoveries. The other instances were just individual finds of pollen grains. Much more has been found here, says Fran Arnsteilgar, an archaeologist and a county curator. Ropes and textiles. Sostelli is further away from current day settlements than other sites where cannabis finds have been made. Hemp is the same plant as cannabis or marijuana, but nothing indicates that the Vikings cultivated the plant to get people high. Most likely it was grown for making textiles and rope. The material that was re-emerged by chance stemmed from a Norwegian-Danish research project at Sostelli in the 1940s and 1950s. Scientists took samples of pollen from a bog during the original dig, the archaeological dig at the Sostelli in 1954. The data was stored in museums' archives. Hemp pollen doesn't carry far in the wind, so scientists think Viking farmers placed their harvested plants on the bogs pretty much where the archaeological samples were found 1,100 years later. This would be an easy way to keep them damp, facilitating the extraction of the outer fibers. The researchers reject the possibility that these were wild plants that had been gathered. This hemp must have been cultivated. We don't know if hemp could have been used as a drug. Most of it was probably used in textile production, says archaeologist Marianne Vedeler at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. Vedeler wasn't involved in the recent study, but she's an expert on textiles from the Viking Age and the Middle Ages. As with flax, used to make linen, the fiber from the cannabis plant can be used for cloths and other textiles. Hemp, of course, has also been used for rope production right into the modern times. Hemp is a fiber that can be used like flax, but is a little coarser, explains Vedeler. The challenge for the archaeologists is that ancient textiles made of hemp and flax tend to rot, and thus are rarely well preserved. This makes it so hard to say how common it was to use textiles. Archaeologists know about the use of wool because its fiber is preserved better than plant fiber. And to top off the list, of course, I cannot leave out alcohol. The main Viking alcoholic beverage were mead and beer. Like all meads, Viking mead was made from honey. The beer was ale made from barley, with hops sometimes being added for flavor. The only other alcoholic beverage the Vikings made themselves was fruit wine, which came from the various fruits that grew in their homelands. Since the Vikings hadn't learned how to distill liquor, these fruit wines were the strongest locally produced drinks. True wine, that is wine made from grapes, came from abroad, largely from the Rhineland, and was an expensive luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Beer and mead were commonly served in drinking horns made from cattle. Since a drinking horn can be put down while there is still drink inside it, its contents had to be drained rather quickly or else passed around the table when the Vikings wanted to set down their drinks and sip from them here and there over the course of a meal. They used wooden cups rather than drinking horns. True wine from the south was served in more refined vessels, often imported pottery jugs or glass cups, or locally manufactured silver bowls. Did we leave any other drug that the Vikings used? Let us know in the comments below and make sure to like and subscribe. Besides doing drugs, the Vikings spend a lot of their times with family making love. So click the video you see on screen now to find out all about Viking love.